Greetings, saints of the Most High. Welcome to another installment of the Messianic Torah Observer. Rod Thomas coming to you on a sunny and sultry Sabbath day here in the DFW. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to fellowship with me here on this blessed day of rest in Yeshua Messiah. And as always, beloved, it is my hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the TMTO finds you, your families, and your fellowships well and blessed. As I am publishing this discussion, it is the second day of the fourth month, 6025, which translates to Sabbath, the Sabbath of June 28, 2025. Today I am led to discuss a key passage of Torah that has lately received a good amount of attention from the American public on the heels of the Iran-Israel, let's include Hamas, include Hezbollah, Houthi conflict. All of these factions, all of these nations and organizations and people coming against Israel. At question here is whether America is commanded to stand, commanded by Torah, commanded by the Bible, to stand with the nation state of Israel as she battles against her enemies, in light of what Jehovah declared unto Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. In that passage, Jehovah says to Abraham, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them or him that curseth thee. The United States is already divided as it relates to what her positions should be towards Israel, as Israel wars with Iran and the various Arab factions challenging her right to exist, to lay claim to the land upon which she dwells, and her treatment of the so-called Palestinians and the various terrorist organizations that claim to have the Palestinians' best interest at heart. Well, recently, a well-known U.S. senator, in an interview with a well-known conservative reporter, declared that he supports the nation-state of Israel from a moral, a financial, and a military standpoint because he believes the Bible commands all believers to stand with Israel, all Christians to stand with Israel. And the senator referenced Genesis, or Bereshit, chapter 12, verse 3a, as the basis for his position. Needless to say, the senator's declaration received much support from the pro-Israel community of the conservative parties of this country, but his words also drew ire, drew criticism from not only the anti-Israel, liberal people or groups of this country, but even from some anti-Israel conservatives who criticized the senator's interpretation of Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Now, I have been intrigued by this story since it aired last week. And despite my continued support for the modern state of Israel, because I believe the state is home to true remnant Israelites, I question the senator's interpretation of Genesis 12:3a. I question the senator's interpretation whether indeed Genesis 12:3a is a commandment to God's people to bless Israel and to not curse Israel. Or is it something else? I've chosen to title this discussion, Does I will bless those who bless and curse those who curse apply to the modern nation of Israel? And this will be part 6 of our Israel's Inextricable Link to Our Salvation series. Let's first look at the scriptural reference itself. As I just mentioned, the scriptural reference the senator was referring to in his response to this reporter's question regarding why the senator supports Israel in their war against Iran is found in various places throughout Scripture. But for our purposes today, I want to focus on Genesis, or Bereshit chapter 12, verse 3. Now, for context, let's read verses 1, 2, and 3 of this chapter. And it is written according to the Scripture's ISR rendering. And Jehovah said to Avram, "Go yourself out of your land, from your relatives and from your father's house, to a land which I show you." Verse 2. "And I shall make you a great nation, and bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." Verse 3, and this is the main crux of our discussion today. "And I shall bless those who bless you, and curse him who curses you. And in you all the clans of the earth shall be blessed." I'll start off by saying that this verse, Genesis chapter 12, verse 3a, is not a commandment, but a prescription. Scholars refer to this verse, the elements of this verse, as a chiastic or a chiasmus. Yah says to his covenant people through Avram that those who do good to them will be blessed by him, and those that do evil to them will be cursed by him. It's a statement of reality that is based on the covenant relationship Jehovah shares with Israel. The structure of this verse is that of a chiasmus, or it's a chiastic. I will bless, or bless in Hebrew, barak. I will barak they that bless you. They that aror, that curse you, I shall curse. Thus, what we have here in this chiasmus or chiastic could be viewed as two sides of a single coin. Those that do good toward you and your descendants will have good done to them, but also those that mistreat you, hey, I will mistreat them as well, according to Yehovah. Now, the Hebrew term barak, which we understand in English to be bless, is the act of bestowing favor and goodness upon another. In the case of Yehovah, when he blesses an individual, he is enacting divine favor and fortune upon the object of his blessing. Conversely, the Hebrew term kilel and aror, which we both understand to be curse in English, is the act of bestowing harm or evil upon someone or something. Of course, as it relates to Elohim, our God, it is the actions taken by Abba Yah that will result in harm or evil upon the object of his, Yah's, ire or anger. The Hebraic concepts of blessings and curses is a whole in-depth study in and of itself, much less that which we're discussing here today regarding Genesis or Bereshit chapter 12, verse 3. But for our purposes today, suffice to understand blessing as honoring another, showing another support, or showing and giving favor to another. Conversely, let us understand curse or kilel as to disrespect, dishonor, and belittle another, while curse as aror denotes Jehovah invoking divine judgment or misfortune upon the object of his anger. So instead of the senator understanding or calling Genesis or Bereshit chapter 12, verse 3, and of course all the parallel verses to this chiastic, instead of him calling a commandment that he has chosen to follow because he's a Christian or a believer in Jesus, he would have been better served to have said that he has chosen to be on the right side, the blessing side of this covenant-based equation. For history has indeed shown, beloved, that this prescriptive covenant provision here in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, is reliable and it's accurate. Just take a look at the United States and, of course, certain other nations whose support of Israel has no doubt contributed to their well-being and blessing since Israel became a nation state in 1948. Now, let's look at what is covenant and what role covenant plays in Yah's declaration to Abraham. What we have at issue here is the foundational element of covenant. Covenant. In Hebrew, covenant is berit. In Greek, it is diatheken. The prescription that Yah places before Avraham and Moshe's readers here, that chiastic, I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you. Well, it must be understood within the framework of the covenant that he, Yah, establishes or cuts with Avraham. For it is only with a firm grasp of what the Almighty was working out through Avram here in this story that begins in verse 1 of this chapter that we can truly understand or interpret this chiastic, that being the literary mirrored concepts and actions relating to blessings resulting in blessings and curses bringing forth curses in relation to Avraham and his descendants. A covenant, or berit, is, quote, a solemn agreement between two parties providing sanctions in the event of non-compliance, end quote. This according to E.A. Spicer in his commentary in Genesis, Introduction, Translation, and Notes. It's a fancy way of saying that a covenant is a legally binding agreement between two parties. And so as it relates to our focus passage of Genesis, or Bereshit chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we're talking about the provisions of a binding legal agreement between Yehovah, creator of the universe, and Avraham and his descendants. Generally speaking, the concept of covenant is specific to a relationship between the creator of the universe and his human creation. Yes, covenants were quite common between men, between humans, but from the perspective of Genesis, or Bereshit chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, and throughout most of the remainder of Torah, covenant is about the relationship that exists between Yehovah and his chosen ones, Avraham and his descendants. And of course, who the said chosen ones are today is up for debate and interpretation, depending upon one's religious or doctrinal orientation. For some see the expansive covenant contained in Torah as involving Yehovah and the Jewish people, while others see it as involving Christians who see themselves as spiritual Israelites. But if we simply stick to the context scripture here, the covenant Yehovah is establishing or is cutting is between himself and Avram or Avraham. And the tenets or the terms of that covenant or agreement extend to Avraham's descendants. And we will touch upon those, who those descendants include later on in our discussion. The covenant relationship Avraham enjoyed with Yehovah would be passed down and perpetuated to and through Avraham's descendants. That same covenant relationship is still in effect today. But through the person and ministries of Yeshua Messiah, the binding tenets and the benefits of that covenant that Yah established with Avraham is not only a birthright of every biological Jew and Hebrew, that being of the 10 tribes, and Judah and Levi and all of them, but is also accessible to every non-Jew and non-Hebrew. who enters a covenant relationship with Jehovah and who abides by the tenets of the covenant as spelled out in the Moshe and Yeshua extensions of the original Abrahamic Covenant. Yeshua's extension is the renewed covenant. He is the facilitator of the renewed covenant, but it's the same covenant. It's just an expansion of the original. The renewed covenant does not replace the original covenant that is stipulated throughout Torah. Now, the Hebraic concept of covenant is extremely broad. It not only identifies the relationship Yah has with certain groups of individuals, but it also determines the makeup or the composition of the rules that govern Yah's relationship with his chosen ones. But because the concept of covenant is such a massive topic and subject that cannot receive the full attention it deserves in just this single post, Abba willing, I will do a teaching on it at a later date. But for our purposes today, specific to Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, I simply want us to recognize that without a modicum of understanding of covenant, that being the relationship agreement Yah established with the patriarchs and their descendants, we cannot understand Genesis or Bereshit 12, verse 3. For the blessings and curses Yah mentions here are governed by the covenant relationship he established or cut with Yisrael or Yasharel. So to whom is Yah addressing this prescriptive provision, if anyone? Well, here in these covenant promises or provisions, Avram is informed by Yah that he, Yah, will be the one taking action on his, Avram's, behalf. For Yah is the dispenser of blessing for the nations, according to Kenneth A. Matthews in his commentary in the New American Commentary. Avram, therefore, cannot lay exclusive claim to Yah's covenant blessings. Let me repeat that again. Avram cannot lay exclusive claim to Yah's covenant blessings, which means that Judaism cannot lay claim to Yah's exclusive blessing as seen here in our focus passage of Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Why? Because Avram and the covenant that Yah establishes or cuts with him, it belongs to Yah. And the simple byproduct of this unique relationship that exists between Jehovah and Avram is that Yah blesses his beloved, including any who would come after Avram and enter into that same faithful, obedient relationship with his Elohim Yehovah. So this is the framework by which things work in the kingdom economy. We enter into a special relationship with Jehovah. We enter into a covenant relationship with Jehovah. And by virtue of being in that special relationship with Jehovah, he blesses and curses wherever and whenever he deems is appropriate and necessary. Now, the principle of blessings and curses that Jehovah levies upon individuals and nation groups is illustrated and explained through the covenant relationship that exists between Yah and Avram, and by extension, Avram's descendants. You see, curses come to those who transgress Yah's Torah, Yah's loving instructions, Yah's instructions in righteousness, while blessings are lavished upon and maintained upon those who operate, who walk within the boundaries of Yah's Torah. Thus, as it relates to Avraham, here in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, blessings or favor come to those who treat Avraham, Yisrael, according to the provisions that are outlined in Torah, the covenant provisions. Curses, on the other hand, fall upon those that choose to treat Avraham contrary to the principles Yah outlined in his Torah. So the blessings and curses prescription that come upon the nations are not based upon the person of Avraham, as some might suppose, or by extension, the whole of Yisrael or Yasharel that bears the name and possesses Avram's heritage, but rather the blessings and curses prescription are brought upon the nations in response to how they treat the relationship that exists between Avraham and by extension Yisrael and Yehovah. Why? Because Avraham, Yisrael, belongs to Yehovah. Thus, those that treat Yisrael properly, in accordance with the principles spelled out in Yah's Torah for the proper treatment of Yah's people, well, they honor Avraham's God, Yehovah, and Yah will bless such individuals and nations. Conversely, those that mistreat Yisrael in contradiction to the principles of proper treatment of Yah's people as outlined, as spelled out in Torah, well, they offend Yah and they bring curses upon themselves. That's why I say this is a prescription. It's a reality of what happens. You touch a hot object, you'll get burnt. If you avoid touching the hot object, you won't be burnt, and you'll be able to enjoy the benefits of what that hot object creates or brings to fruition, like on a stove. I meant a stove. I should have said that earlier. So it's a prescription. It's a reality of the covenant agreement that exists between Yehovah and Avraham, by extension, Yisrael. Let's look at the chiasmus of Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Being a tenet of Abba's plan of salvation, redemption, and restoration. The covenant that Yah presents to Avram here in Genesis 12 is described by Torah resources Tim Haig as, quote, the unfolding revelation of Yah's plan to bless mankind through the family of Avraham, end quote. And this is Mr. Haig's, Dr. Haig's commentary on this passage in his studies of the Torah Genesis. The blessings and curses element of this passage is a stark reality of what happens to those individuals who get on board with the covenant Yah establishes with Avraham, and those who, for whatever reason, choose to challenge or harm the covenant relationship along with the will and plans of Yah. Within this ever-expanding covenant that Abba Yah establishes or cuts with Yisrael are the essential provisions for humanity's salvation. Unbeknown to millions of self-professing Christians around the world, however, is this seldom mentioned reality that anyone who truly desires to receive the salvation that Yah is offering humanity and enter into his coming kingdom, well, they themselves must enter an obedient, faith-based covenant relationship with Yehovah alongside their Hebrew cousins. For Yah made just one covenant with humanity, one covenant. And that one covenant is the one he cut with Avraham and Avraham's descendants. Shaul, the Apostle Paul, fully recognized the realities of this in his correspondence to the Messianic assemblies in Galatia. And Rome, actually. I forgot about that one in Romans. Let's look at the first one, Romans. Romans chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. And Shaul writes, according to the Legacy Study Bible, or Legacy Standard Bible, verse 11, and he, the he being Avraham, received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, that righteousness might be counted to them. Verse 12. And the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also follow in the steps of the faith of their father Abraham, which he had while uncircumcised. And again, that was Romans chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. But then we have over in Galatians chapter 3, verse 29, the following, and the Legacy Standard Bible reads, and if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed. You are heirs according to promise. Thus, we are justified and imputed righteousness by the court of heaven, by virtue of Yehoshua's atoning sacrifice and our faith in his person and ministries. And so we are blessed of Yah out of all of humanity, not just because we are being saved, but also because we have been grafted into the commonwealth of Yisrael, Yasharel, and are in a covenant relationship with the creator of the universe. So in every sense, this is good news. Good news and the fulfillment of the last sentence of Genesis, or Bereshit chapter 12, verse 3. Where Yah says to Avram, and all families of the earth will be blessed in you. In accordance with Yah's plan and will, Yah took the promise of a Messiah who would undo what the enemy and Adam did in the garden, known by scholars as the Proto-Evangelion in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and chose Avraham. He chose Avraham and his seed to bring this promise to fruition. For indeed, it would be that in you, Avraham, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, I've sought over the course of many discussions and teachings on this platform to hammer home the stark reality that Yah chose just the one man and his descendants from all humanity throughout human history to establish, to cut a covenant with. And this covenant would not only be about a people and their relationship with the creator of the universe and the land that the creator promised his covenant people, but would also result in many sons and daughters coming into a relationship with their creator and receiving his glorious kingdom. And that one man is none other than Avraham. Furthermore, Yah chose just one man to facilitate or mediate the covenant's redemptive, salvific, restorative promises through. And that one man is none other than Yeshua Messiah. The chiasmus, or the chiastic of Genesis 12:3, can be viewed as sort of an insurance policy or security system for the maintenance and integrity of this covenant that Yah established with Avraham and his descendants. And we, of course, are included in that covenant. For indeed, Yah is zealous for his elect and will do whatever it takes to back and perpetuate that covenant, his plan, and his will in the earth. In other words, the world is wise to respect the covenant, to respect the plan and the will of the Almighty. For those that do so will be favored of Yah, but those that disrespect the covenant, disrespect the plan, disrespect the will of the Almighty will find themselves on the wrong side of history. So let's look at what the bottom line is when it comes to this prescriptive covenant provision of Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. How should we interpret it and what should we make of it? People who have personal issues regarding the modern state of Israel, or even the Jewish people of this world, in all reality, have an adverse personal issue with the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Jacob. How so, you may ask? Well, Yah loves Yisrael. Contrary to what's being put out there in the press, on social media, and throughout every platform available, Yah loves Yisrael. Jehovah has and continues to be, for the better part of 4 millennia, been in an unbreakable covenant relationship with her. Be it the Jewish people who live and operate in Haaretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, be they Jews, be they secular or religious Jews, living throughout the world, also Messianic Jews, also Nazarene Israelites, or what have you, Yah maintains that same covenant relationship with them that he established with Abraham and his descendants back in Genesis chapter 12. And despite Yisrael's many faults, I'm talking about the religious Jews and the secular Jews of, let's just say, the modern state of Israel, despite Yisrael's many faults and even, yes, her rejection of Yeshua as her Messiah, as in the case of secular religious Jews, and of which Scripture informs us they will ultimately accept Yeshua as their King and Mashiach, they remain beloved of Yehovah. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 9. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 8. Hosea chapter 3, verse 1, and Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, and of course, Romans chapter 11, verse 26, all attest to this. And Yah has always maintained his love for Yisrael because of his covenant relationship with Avraham, who Yah referred to as his friend forever. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 7, Isaiah chapter 41, verse 8, and James chapter 2, verse 23. Yet today we have a great many newspaper eschatologists, to borrow this title from Messianic Apologetics' J.K. McKee, these newspaper eschatologists, and not a few armchair self-righteous secularists who've made it their business to interpret and teach Scripture to we who are Yah's chosen ones, insisting that the Jews of today are not the descendants of the Jews and Hebrews of our Bibles. And so these naysayers, well, they have no covenant relationship with the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Jacob. Nor is Yah's indwelling spirit, his Ruach, operating within them. Thus, these lost souls have nothing of any value to say to us. We are therefore best served to place our trust upon the sure foundation of Yeshua Messiah and Yah's eternal and holy word of truth, his Torah. As disciples of Yehoshua, we are to love what Yehovah loves. We are to hate what Yehovah hates. Amos chapter 5, verse 15, and Hebrews chapter 1, verse 9. And if Yah loves Israel, or Judah, as Scripture clearly denotes, we as well must love Judah. Now, how that love is manifested by us is certainly debatable. One could certainly argue that loving or blessing Yisrael means standing by and supporting the nation state of Yisrael morally, financially, prayerfully, and even militarily. Conversely, one could argue that loving Yisrael while remaining within the realm of the covenant Yisrael has with Yehovah could mean simply interceding, praying, financially supporting, and spiritually backing our Jewish cousins who are either living in Yisrael proper or anywhere else in the world. Now, loving and supporting Yisrael or Yasharel doesn't have to mean that we must agree with or morally support everything Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his secular government do and say. But our love and support of Yisrael must, at the very least, be done in accordance with Yah's Torah instructions and the teachings and example of Yeshua, our Messiah. For it all comes down to loving our Elohim with our whole being, and then loving our neighbor, in this case, Yasharel, as much as we love ourselves. Master stated that, quote, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Matthew 22, verse 40. So we as the elect of Yah must approach our blessing of Yisrael through the paradigm of covenant, the specifics of which are contained in Torah and in the teachings of our Master Yeshua. Yehovah and Yeshua instruct us on how we are to treat our neighbor, even Yisrael. So here are my closing thoughts and reflections on this issue. Genesis, Bereshit, chapter 12, verse 3, is so much more than pro-Israel conservatives standing in support of the modern nation of Israel. Whether that support comes in the form of prayers, intercessions on Yisrael's behalf, verbal moral affirmations in their existential struggles against the enemies of Yah and of his people, and or sending financial and material support to Yisrael by America's government or supportive individuals and non-profit organizations. These are certainly noble efforts and actions, and such supportive actions may indeed be deemed acts of blessing or barak Yisrael by the court of heaven, blessing Yisrael by the court of heaven. But this prescriptive covenant principle or provision of Genesis chapter 12, verse 3 is more about treating all of Yah's chosen and loved ones in accordance with Yah's Torah instructions. Yah in his Torah instructs his people how they are to treat, how they are to bless one another. And so it comes down to doing the right thing and doing that which Yehovah expects us to do. But at the end of the day, beloved, Genesis chapter 12, verse 3 is not in and of itself a commandment to support the modern state of Israel, as some have stated. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3 is simply a prescriptive reality of the covenant relationship Yisrael, Judah, Nazarenes, any who belong to Yah via the auspices of the Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, and renewed covenants, possess and walk in. Simply put, obey Yah's Torah and be blessed. Disobey Yah's Torah and be cursed. And this is all spelled out in Deuteronomy chapter 28 through chapter 30. So this prescription applies to those operating within Yah's covenant and those outside the covenant. Again, history bears out that all who have come against the covenant Yah has with his chosen ones ultimately come to a bitter end. So does the prescriptive covenant provision of Genesis 12:3 apply to the modern nation state of Israel? Yes. But it's the bigger picture involving covenant, Torah, salvation, redemption, and restoration that Yah wants us to grasp here. It not only applies to the modern nation state of Israel, but to every soul who is of the commonwealth of Yisrael. These all come under the provision of Yah's covenant with Avraham, and most importantly, are all beloved of Yehovah. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Until next time, beloved, take care.